You have lost the avoidance respect through your accommodation of their patterns, through your acceptance of their inadequate treatment without implementing consequences, through your continued pursuit despite their withdrawal, through your patient tolerance of their defended limitations that taught them you would remain available regardless of how poorly they treated you. The avoidant does not respect you, because respect requires them to believe you have boundaries they cannot violate without cost. It requires them to perceive you as a person who will enforce consequences rather than a person who makes threats they never implement. It requires them to recognize you possess the capacity to remove yourself from their reach if they fail to meet minimum relationship standards. Your historical pattern has taught them the opposite, that you will tolerate their withdrawal, will accept their sporadic contact as sufficient, will accommodate their emotional unavailability indefinitely, and will remain available despite their patterns consistently demonstrating they do not value your presence enough to modify their behavior to maintain it. This loss of respect manifests in how they treat you. They cancel plans knowing you will accept their excuses. They withdraw knowing you will wait patiently for their return. They provide minimal effort knowing you will remain despite that inadequacy. They ignore your expressed needs knowing you will continue expressing those needs without establishing consequences when they continue ignoring them. The avoidant's lack of respect for you is not a personal assessment of your worth. It is a rational response to your demonstrated pattern of accepting treatment that should trigger your boundaries, of remaining present despite the harm their patterns cause, of maintaining availability that requires no adequate reciprocal effort from them. You have trained them through your behavior that they need not take you seriously, because taking you seriously would require believing you will actually leave or actually enforce consequences. And your history proves you will not leave despite repeatedly threatening to, and will not enforce consequences despite repeatedly establishing them verbally, then failing to implement them when they continue their patterns. The respect switch, the moment when the avoidant suddenly begins taking you seriously again, treating you with consideration they had ceased providing, and investing effort they had previously withheld, occurs not through your convincing them you deserve respect, not through explaining why their treatment is unacceptable, and not through requesting or demanding better treatment. The respect switch activates through your demonstrated shift in behavior, where you stop accommodating their patterns and start enforcing consequences, where you stop pursuing their attention and start genuinely redirecting your focus to your own life, and where you stop remaining available despite their inadequacy and start actually removing yourself when they fail to meet standards you establish. The switch is binary rather than gradual. The avoidant does not slowly develop respect through your incremental boundary setting. Rather, respect switches on suddenly when specific conditions align that force them to recognize you have fundamentally changed from a person who tolerates their patterns into a person who enforces consequences for those patterns. Understanding what triggers this respect switch allows you to activate it through your behavior rather than remaining trapped, hoping they will eventually respect you while continuing patterns that guarantee they will not. Respect switches when you stop explaining yourself and start enforcing consequences. You have spent extensive time explaining to the avoidant why their behavior is unacceptable, why their patterns harm you, why you need different treatment, and why the relationship cannot continue if they do not change. You have articulated your needs clearly, have described how their withdrawal affects you, have communicated boundaries you claim to have established, and have expressed hurt and frustration about their inadequate presence. Yet, these explanations have generated no change in their behavior and have actually decreased their respect for you, because every explanation without corresponding action teaches them that your words are empty, that your boundaries are negotiable, and that you will continue accepting their patterns regardless of how eloquently you articulate why those patterns are problematic. The avoidant has learned through repeated experience that your explanations are noise they can ignore, because explanations are never followed by consequences that actually cost them access to you or the comfort they derive from your accommodation. The respect switch activates when you stop explaining and start enforcing. You stop articulating why their behavior is unacceptable, and you simply establish that it is unacceptable through your actions. You do not explain why you are leaving when they canceled plans again. You simply make other plans and become unavailable to them. You do not explain why their withdrawal is harmful. You simply stop pursuing them when they withdraw and redirect your attention to your own life. You do not explain what boundaries you are establishing. You simply enforce those boundaries through consequences that follow immediately when they violate them. This shift from verbal explanation to silent enforcement changes everything because enforcement communicates what explanation never could. You are serious, you will follow through, and your boundaries are real rather than negotiating positions. The enforcement must be immediate and consistent rather than delayed or sporadic. When the avoidant violates your boundary or engages in a pattern you have decided you will no longer tolerate, the consequence follows immediately without warning, without discussion, and without negotiation. They cancel plans. You immediately make other plans and become unavailable when they eventually want to reschedule. They withdraw emotionally. You immediately redirect your emotional energy elsewhere rather than waiting patiently for their return. They provide minimal effort. You immediately match that minimal effort rather than continuing to provide maximum effort, hoping they will eventually reciprocate. The immediacy and consistency of enforcement teaches them that your boundaries have teeth, that their patterns generate predictable costs they cannot avoid through their usual tactics of minimizing or promising to do better. The enforcement particularly activates respect when it occurs without explanation, without discussion, and without giving them opportunity to negotiate or minimize. The avoidant is accustomed to your patterns where you establish a verbal boundary, then engage in extensive discussion when they violate it, giving them opportunity to provide excuses, to minimize the violation, and to promise improvement that allows the relationship to continue without them facing actual consequences. When you enforce without explaining, when the consequence simply occurs without negotiation or discussion, the avoidant faces that their behavior has generated an outcome they cannot talk their way out of, cannot minimize, and cannot avoid through their usual defensive mechanisms. This non-negotiable enforcement communicates power and seriousness that explanations never communicated. The shift from explaining to enforcing also protects your energy and your dignity. Every explanation you provide that is not followed by enforcement drains your energy and diminishes you. You are essentially begging them to treat you better while demonstrating you will accept their continued poor treatment. The enforcement eliminates this dynamic by ending the begging and by demonstrating through action that you do not need to convince them to treat you adequately because you will simply remove yourself if they do not. This shift restores your dignity and your power because you are no longer seeking their approval or their willingness to change. You are simply establishing standards and enforcing them regardless of their response. The avoidance respect switches on when they recognize that the enforcement pattern is genuine and sustained rather than a temporary reaction. The first time you enforce consequences without explaining, they may assume you are angry and will return to explaining once you calm down. The second and third times you enforce consistently, they begin recognizing you have fundamentally shifted from a person who explains and tolerates to a person who enforces and removes yourself. This recognition triggers respect because they face that they can no longer rely on your accommodation, that their patterns now carry real costs, and that you have become a person they must take seriously because you demonstrate through sustained enforcement that your boundaries are actual limits rather than negotiating positions. Respect switches when you stop explaining yourself and start enforcing consequences. The switch is not gradual. It occurs at the precise moment when the avoidant recognizes your enforcement pattern is genuine and sustained, when they understand their usual tactics will not restore your accommodation, and when they face that you have become a fundamentally different person who will no longer tolerate what you previously accepted. This recognition generates respect not because they suddenly value you more, but because they suddenly recognize you are a serious threat to remove yourself, a serious risk they could lose access to you, and a serious person who enforces rather than a person who merely complains. The respect emerges from their rational assessment that you have changed from a manageable, accommodating presence to an unpredictable, enforcing presence they must take seriously to maintain access to. The avoidant respects you the moment they realize you've genuinely stopped caring. The avoidant has maintained a comfortable position throughout the relationship based on their awareness that you care intensely about them, about the relationship, and about whether they reciprocate your feelings and your investment. Your visible caring provided them security that you would remain despite their patterns, because people who care intensely do not easily leave, do not readily give up, and continue investing even when reciprocation is inadequate. Your expressions of hurt demonstrated you cared enough to be hurt by their behavior. Your pursuit after their withdrawal demonstrated you cared enough to work to restore connection. Your patience with their patterns demonstrated you cared enough to tolerate inadequacy, hoping they would eventually provide more. All this visible caring eliminated any pressure for them to change, because your caring guaranteed you would remain available regardless of whether they addressed their patterns. The respect switch activates at the precise moment when the avoidant recognizes you have genuinely stopped caring. Not that you are pretending indifference to manipulate them, not that you are temporarily hurt or angry, but that you have authentically released your investment in them and in the relationship. This genuine cessation of caring manifests through specific observable changes in your behavior that cannot be performed or faked. You do not check their social media because you are not curious about their life. You do not feel activated when you hear about them through mutual connections because they no longer generate an emotional response in you. You make plans and decisions without considering their potential reaction or their possible involvement because they are not a factor in your thinking. You discuss them neutrally, without emotion, when their name arises because they have become a person from your past, rather than a person who occupies present space in your emotional world. The avoidant recognizes your genuine stopped caring through what is absent rather than through what is present. You are not trying to make them jealous through posting strategic content. You have simply stopped considering whether they see what you post. You are not withholding contact to punish them. You have simply stopped thinking about contacting them because they are not on your mind. You are not establishing boundaries to control their behavior. You have simply removed yourself because you no longer care enough to invest energy in managing relationship dynamics. This absence of effort, absence of strategy, and absence of emotional investment communicates an authenticity that the avoidant's sensitive detection of others' states allows them to recognize. You have not switched to a different strategy. You have genuinely released them. The genuine stopped caring activates respect specifically because it eliminates all the avoidant's usual mechanisms for managing you and maintaining a comfortable position. When you cared intensely, they could manage your emotional state through providing minimal gestures that would restore your hope and your patience. When you stopped caring genuinely, these minimal gestures generate no response because you are not emotionally invested enough to respond to them. When you cared, they could withdraw knowing you would pursue and would work to restore connection. When you stopped caring, their withdrawal simply creates permanent distance because you are not pursuing. When you cared, they held power through their capacity to affect your emotional state through their behavior. When you stopped caring, they have no power because you are not affected by what they do or do not do. The respect emerges specifically because genuine stopped caring represents a threat the avoidant cannot manage through their usual defensive mechanisms. They cannot make you care again through their tactics because genuine cessation of caring is not a strategy they can outmaneuver. It is an authentic internal shift that has removed you from their emotional reach. They cannot restore the comfortable dynamic where you care intensely and they manage your caring through controlled provision because you are no longer available to that dynamic. They cannot maintain the belief that you will always be available because your genuine stopped caring demonstrates you have become unavailable in a fundamental way their patterns cannot reverse. The genuine nature of the stopped caring is critical. The avoidant easily detects performed indifference and dismisses it as a strategy they can outlast. You cannot activate the respect switch through pretending not to care while actually remaining invested, through strategic no contact while obsessing about them, or through posted content designed to make them jealous while checking whether they viewed it. The avoidant's attunement to others' emotional states allows them to distinguish authentic release from performed indifference and genuine disinterest from strategic positioning. The respect switches on only when your stopped caring is real rather than performed, when you have authentically released investment rather than strategically withdrawing while remaining attached. The timeline for achieving genuine, stopped caring varies. Some people reach authentic release quickly through recognizing the relationship's dysfunction. Others require extended time and often a new focus or new connection that facilitates releasing the old attachment. Yet the mechanism remains consistent. Respect switches on when the avoidant recognizes you have genuinely stopped caring, because that genuine release eliminates their comfortable position and creates a threat they cannot manage through usual tactics. Your authentic indifference communicates what your caring never could, that you have become unavailable to them in ways their patterns cannot reverse, that they face genuine loss of access to you, and that they must take you seriously because you are no longer accessible to their management. Respect emerges when they discover you've built a life that doesn't need them. The avoidant has maintained a comfortable position based partly on the belief that they occupy a central, important role in your life, that your well-being depends to a significant degree on having access to them, and that you need what they provide enough that you will tolerate their inadequate provision to maintain some access rather than having no access at all. This belief developed through your historical behavior where your life appeared to organize around them. You made yourself available when they wanted contact. You adjusted your schedule to accommodate their sporadic availability. You maintained emotional space for them despite their inadequate presence. And you demonstrated through your behavior that they were a priority in your life, even when you were not a priority in theirs. This dynamic, where you needed them more than they needed you, provided them a comfortable position where they could provide minimal effort while receiving maximum accommodation, because your need for them guaranteed you would accept whatever minimal provision they offered. The respect switch activates when the avoidant discovers you have built a satisfying life that does not need them or include space for them. This discovery occurs through their observation of your actual life rather than through your telling them about your life. They see through social media, through mutual connections, or through chance encounters that you are genuinely thriving, that your time is occupied with activities and relationships that appear satisfying, that you have invested in yourself and your own life rather than remaining oriented toward them and their potential return. They observe that you are busy when they reach out rather than immediately available, that you have plans that do not flex to accommodate their sporadic availability, and that you discuss goals and activities that do not reference them or include consideration of their involvement. The built life that activates respect must be genuine rather than performed. You cannot activate the respect switch through posting strategic content designed to make them think you are thriving while actually remaining stuck processing the relationship. You cannot generate their respect through telling them about your wonderful life while your actual daily experience remains consumed with thoughts of them. The avoidant will detect performance through inconsistencies between your projected image and your actual energy, through your availability when they test it despite your claims of being busy, and through your emotional activation when you interact with them despite your presentation of having moved on completely. The genuine built life that generates respect has specific observable qualities. Your time is actually occupied with activities you genuinely enjoy rather than with distractions designed to avoid processing the loss. Your emotional energy flows toward people and pursuits that are actually in your life rather than remaining oriented toward the person who is no longer accessible. Your goals and plans reflect genuine forward movement rather than remaining on hold, pending their potential return or potential reconciliation. And your presentation of thriving reflects an actual internal state of building a satisfying life rather than reflecting a performance designed to attract their attention or make them regret losing you. The respect emerges specifically because your built independent life eliminates their significance in your world. When your life organized around them, they held a central position that guaranteed their importance regardless of their minimal effort. When your life no longer includes space for them, when your well-being does not depend on having access to them, and when your satisfaction comes from sources that do not include them, they face that they have become irrelevant rather than central, that they no longer matter in ways that would give them power or position in your life. This loss of significance generates respect because it demonstrates they cannot assume importance to you, cannot rely on your need for them to maintain their comfortable position, and cannot take for granted that you would welcome their renewed contact or increased presence. The built life also demonstrates a capacity they did not believe you possessed. The avoidant maintained a comfortable position partly through the implicit belief that you could not thrive without them, that you needed them too much to build a satisfying life independently, and that your tolerance of their inadequacy reflected your lack of alternatives or your inability to be satisfied without them. Your demonstration of actually building a thriving, independent life contradicts this belief and forces recognition that you possess a capacity they underestimated, that you can be satisfied without them, and that you have alternatives and options that make their minimal provision unnecessary rather than better than nothing. The discovery of your built independent life activates respect at the moment when the avoidant recognizes your life is genuine rather than performed, sustained rather than temporary, and satisfying rather than compensatory. This recognition typically occurs gradually as they observe consistency in your thriving over time, as they test your availability and discover you are genuinely unavailable rather than strategically withholding, and as they attempt to restore the previous dynamic and discover you have no interest in returning to patterns that your new life has made unnecessary. The respect switches on when accumulated evidence forces them to accept you have genuinely moved forward into a life that does not need them, that their comfortable assumptions about your need for them were wrong, and that they face potential permanent exclusion from the life you are building that appears satisfying without them. They take you seriously when their patterns suddenly cost them real access. The avoidant has maintained their defended patterns throughout the relationship without facing real costs because your accommodation eliminated consequences that would have made those patterns unsustainable. They withdrew repeatedly, yet you remained available for their return, no cost for withdrawal. They provided minimal effort, yet you continued providing maximum accommodation, no cost for minimal provision. They canceled plans, yet you continued making yourself available for future plans. No cost for unreliability. They maintained emotional unavailability, yet you continued offering emotional intimacy. No cost for defended distance. This pattern, where their defended behavior generated no actual cost, taught them they need not take your complaints seriously because complaints without consequences are requests they can ignore without facing any impact on their comfort or their access to you. The respect switch activates when their patterns suddenly begin costing them real access to you, access to your time, your attention, your emotional investment, your physical presence, and your accommodation of their needs. The cost must be immediate, concrete, and substantial, rather than theoretical, delayed, or minimal. When they cancel plans, the immediate cost is they lose access to your time. You make other plans and are genuinely unavailable when they want to reschedule rather than remaining available pending their convenience. When they withdraw emotionally, the immediate cost is they lose access to your emotional investment. You redirect your emotional energy elsewhere and are genuinely disengaged when they return rather than waiting emotionally available. When they provide minimal effort, the immediate cost is they receive minimal reciprocation. You match their investment level rather than continuing to overfunction while they underfunction. The costs that activate respect must be real rather than threatened. You have likely threatened costs throughout the relationship. Threaten to leave if they do not change, threaten to stop tolerating their patterns, and threaten to establish boundaries they must respect. Yet these threats, without implementation, taught them your threats are empty, that you will not actually follow through, and that they can continue their patterns without facing the costs you threaten. The respect switches on when you stop threatening costs and start implementing costs, when they discover through direct experience that their patterns now generate immediate concrete consequences you do not negotiate about or withdraw when they promise to do better. The implementation of real costs must be consistent rather than sporadic. If you implement costs once, then return to accommodation when they provide a minimal gesture of improvement, you teach them that costs are temporary obstacles they can overcome through minimal effort rather than a permanent new reality they must adapt to. The respect requires sustained, consistent implementation where every instance of their problematic pattern generates a predictable cost they cannot avoid through their usual tactics. This consistency forces recognition that you have fundamentally changed the dynamic, that their patterns will now consistently cost them access rather than occasionally generating costs they can minimize or negotiate. The real costs activate respect specifically because they force the avoidant to choose between maintaining their patterns and maintaining access to you, a choice they did not have to make when your accommodation allowed them both. The avoidant faces that continuing their withdrawal pattern costs them your availability, continuing their minimal effort costs them your investment, continuing their unreliability costs them your prioritization of them, and continuing their emotional unavailability costs them your emotional engagement. These choices force recognition that maintaining their comfortable patterns now conflicts with maintaining comfortable access to you, that they cannot have both, and that continuing patterns means accepting genuine loss of access rather than accepting your complaints while retaining full access. The respect emerges when the avoidant recognizes the costs are a permanent change rather than a temporary reaction they can outlast. Initial implementation of costs may generate their assumption you are punishing them temporarily, that you will return to accommodation once you calm down or once they provide minimal appeasement. Sustained implementation forces recognition that costs are the new permanent reality of engaging with you, that you have fundamentally changed the terms where their patterns now generate consequences their accommodation previously prevented. This recognition activates respect because they must take you seriously as a person who will actually enforce consequences rather than a person who merely complains about patterns while continuing to accommodate them. The respect switch particularly activates when the costs accumulate to the point where the avoidant recognizes continued pattern maintenance will result in complete loss of access. A single cost, losing access to your time once when they cancel, may generate minimal impact.